A physician that I know, not a member of this congregation, was at one point in his career facing a significant low due to an outcome that wasn't what he had hoped for. Now, despite the fact that he had been honored as one of the top 100 physicians in the country, when this low hit, he became worried that it would ultimately shake his confidence. So he called his uncle, who was also a physician, a psychiatrist, to talk about it. He laid out the issues that he was facing, told his uncle that he was concerned that this could become a career-ending low, and that he wasn't sure how to navigate the next steps. His uncle replied with sage advice, saying, "Don't worry, your narcissistic ego won't let you do that." He went on to say, "I don't mean that unkindly. I don't think you are any more or less narcissistic than anyone else. What I mean is that a healthy psyche will prevent you from believing your own worst self-doubts. Honestly," he went on, "a little self-doubt can even make you a better physician. It only becomes a problem when it prevents you from seeing the truth." But that's the problem, isn't it, sometimes? Sometimes the truth is hard to hear, hard to bear, hard to live with, isn't it? But when Jesus is preaching his Sermon on the Mount, he is engaged in an exercise in truth-telling. It looks at the outset that Jesus is opining on the law, and certainly he is. But what he is really doing is inviting us to take our lives with all of their complexities and put them under the microscope. Now, the law, you see, is not so much God's standard for us as it is God's hopes and dreams for humankind. And I do understand that this can be a somewhat counterintuitive way to view the law, because so often our lives do seem to cry out for structure and standards. Certainly the law provides both, perhaps at times in a rigid and apparently judgmental way, but that is a superficial understanding of the law, and that is precisely what Jesus wants his listeners to push beyond. So let's take a minute this morning to understand the law before we look at what Jesus is saying about it. Now, specifically, when we talk about the law, we are referring to the Torah. The Torah is found in the first 5 books of the Bible, and it is the means by which God creates sacred community. Now, yes, there are rules in the law. I don't want to gloss over that. There are. But to get hung up on the rules themselves is to miss the greater point of the law. The point is that God values community and connection so much that God creates a covenant around it in order to lay out a path that we might live in this sacred community whereby who God is will be made known to the world. And the way that God goes about creating this community is not just worth noting, it is the very foundation of the covenant. Now, the 10 Commandments occur twice in the Hebrew Scriptures. They are in Exodus and in Deuteronomy. These, of course, are 2 of the books of the Torah. In Exodus, they occur in the middle of a narrative story. It's the story of God's salvation of Israel. In Deuteronomy, though, they occur in a lengthy discourse about the law, expanding on what it means. And in each case, whether in the story or in the sermon, they begin with these words: "I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the house of bondage." And that's important. Because the funny thing about the 10 Commandments is that they're not really just a bunch of rules on a page. They actually form the basis of a treaty. It's a lopsided treaty because it's between God on the one hand and the people on the other hand. And the other thing about it that's sort of odd is that as treaties go, it's really sort of a Don Corleone kind of treaty. It's an offer they can't refuse. Now remember how they start off. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the house of bondage. The first words to come out of God's mouth are words about God's saving activity. So what follows is not a treaty that says, if you do all of these things, Israel, I'm going to take care of you, but rather, I have done all of these things, Israel. Now let me take care of you. Do you hear the difference? It's a treaty. And they don't have a choice about being God's beloved. But God has already done everything God has pledged to do. That's how God does things. By the time we get around to the 30th chapter of Deuteronomy, from which we read this morning, Moses is an old man. He has been to the mountaintop and seen the promised land, but he also knows that he will not enter into it. He has learned that Joshua is to be his successor, and Joshua will lead the people forward into the promised land. But Moses won't go, and so the old man Moses got up to preach one of his last sermons to the people that he had led for 40 years. Now, have you ever noticed how the last sermon tends to get really simple? When the preacher knows that he or she only has one or two shots left at making clear what is the most important thing to them, the sermons get really simple. And this is what Moses does. He puts before the people a simple choice. There is a way to live that gives life, he says, and there's a way you can live that will rob you of life. Isn't that the truth? It's so simple. There is a way to go that yields life. Now remember, we're not talking about salvation. God's already done all of that. We're talking about those choices we face that are a matter of consequence. If we choose the one way, the decision will be life-giving for us. And if we choose the other, the decision may very well suck the life right out of us. My friend D.C. Horn has a simple metric for decision making when she is faced with big decisions. She learned this from a Jesuit priest with whom she did campus ministry for 10 or 15 years or so. And it's absolutely as simple as the choice that Moses preached about. The Jesuit priest said to her one day, if you think of a choice and the one way looks to you like it will suck the life out of you, it probably will. So Moses preaches to the people, there is a choice before you. Choose life. And by the time we get to Matthew's gospel, Jesus is standing on the mountaintop, just like Moses, preaching the very same sermon. It's not subtle, this cue in Matthew. It's writ large. I know it may not jump off the page at us, but I promise you, Matthew's Jewish audience would have caught every word of this. They would know that this is Jesus preaching Moses' sermon. But he doesn't just re-preach Moses' words. No, Jesus tells them to push past the words and get to the heart of the law. In his sermon, I know the words look harsh, in his sermon, he is engaged in some serious truth-telling. And when we look at what Jesus says, it is awfully easy to counter, well, that's going to be a challenge. When we look at what he says about anger or lust or honest dealings, it is hard at times to want to tell the whole truth. There are plenty of obstacles to us telling the truth to ourselves and to others. I imagine we all have our favorite reasons for not wanting to look too closely in the mirror. But Jesus invites us to do just that. He seems to say to us, how are you doing? How's your life going? Are you on a path of life? Or maybe, are there some things that need to change for you to be on the path of life? See, Jesus understands we all need to be honest with ourselves sometimes. And if we can't be honest with God, well, then whom can we be truly honest with? We all need to be honest with ourselves because there's something deadly about the belief that the things we do don't amount to a hill of beans. That really gets at the heart of what Dietrich Bonhoeffer called cheap grace. It's hearing the words, letting go of what we perceive about our sin, and not being honest with ourselves about what that grace calls for from us. And remember, God's done it all. But then God says, do these things. The late William Meale, preaching at Yale years ago, noted that it is a terrible thing to take away from the individual the belief that what they do can make a change. Jesus is saying that what we do matters. I love the way the mystic poet Bianco da Siena captures it in a poem from the 15th century, which we will sing later in the hymn, Come Down, O Love Divine. But our hymnal leaves out a verse, as it does from time to time, and I particularly like this verse as it speaks to telling the truth to ourselves and to God. Listen, let holy charity mine outward vesture be, and lowliness become mine inner clothing. True lowliness of heart, which takes the humbler part, and o'er its own shortcomings weeps with loathing. Now, I'm frankly more than a little grateful that our theology as a denomination doesn't lead us to sit around wringing our hands and weeping with loathing, at least not much of the time. It's a useful exercise, but after a while it can become a bit neurotic, narcissistic even. But nonetheless, we do well to take honest stock of our lives. We do well to take stock of what's really, truly important. That's what Jesus is saying when he points us back to the heart of the law. If we've gotten hung up on the trappings, he points us back to where it begins, back to God's activity, back to God's saving activity, in which all of our activities are always grounded. That is the ultimate truth that allows us to tell the truth about ourselves, to ourselves, and to others. We can't get hung up on the trappings and still tell the truth. Listen, it's so easy to say, you have heard it was said. Well, I haven't killed anyone today, so I have done what God has asked of me. Is that really telling the truth about violence and attitudes? Is that really telling the truth about when those times occur that breathe anger and resentfulness into our relationships? It's so easy to say, well, I haven't actually had an affair with anyone, so I've done what God expects from me. But is that really being honest with ourselves and with God if we allow lust and a wandering eye to erode at the foundation of trust that is the bedrock of a marriage? It's really sort of easy to say, I've kept the letter of the contract. I have done exactly what is on this page. So I've done what God's required of me. And then to decimate the relationship on which the contract is based. When Jesus says, "You have heard it was said, but I say to you," he is calling us to go deeper. And I do understand that it can be easy to reply, yes, but that's going to be a challenge. And of course, we do know how truth-telling worked out for Jesus. But nonetheless, he persists in calling us to righteousness. Jesus needs a few righteous people willing to tell the truth. And I suspect that for many of us, the biggest obstacle that we face in regard to that is the fear of hypocrisy. My hunch is we are afraid that if we speak earnestly and honestly about what God calls forth from us in our lives, that we'll come off as being somehow self-righteous rather than righteous. William Sloane Coffin aptly captured that fear when he wrote, "You can't be proud and Christian both. How God must despise the sounds of those who pray this day, thy kingdom come, and tomorrow bar its way. How God must despise the spectacle of Christians who climb up upon the cross to be seen from afar, thereby trampling the one who has hung there for so long." What a terrifying prospect. But nobody ever said faith would be neat and clean, did we? And that's not what God is calling us to, what Jesus is calling us to in embracing true righteousness. He calls us to step in faith, not in fear, and to dare to look into the heart of God. Because righteousness is looking into the law and seeing there the heart of God. And the heart of God is love. So the heart of the law is love. And living in the heart of God, living in God's love, we are invited to tell the truth to ourselves and to one another, about ourselves and one another, and the world we live in the ways God calls us to engage with that world. That's going to be a challenge. But perhaps the most important thing we need to remember when we're talking about the truth is that the truth is not a creed or a doctrine. The truth is a person. And the truth is a Savior. And the truth is a shepherd. And the truth will hold you in tender care. And yes, in the final estimation, the truth will, in every way that matters, set you free from the house of bondage.